Welcome to the next episode of The Open Ground. Today's exploration: the Peterson phenomenon, why smart people talk past each other, a perpetualist, analysis of symbolic density and modal dissonance. Oh, and not to skip my favorite part of these videos, a small meta-reflection, from mapping to encounter. This essay extends the inquiry begun on the modalities of thought, where the conditions for critique were first established as modal, not merely discursive. There, the argument was abstract, that before one can disagree, one must recognize how thought is structured, how modalities shape meaning, coherence, and even the criteria by which disagreement becomes possible. What was offered was a philosophical scaffold. Here, we step into the terrain of application. The Peterson phenomenon is not a defense of Peterson's conclusions, nor a rehabilitation of his posture. It is an encounter with the reality that his thought and the misreadings of it arise not from surface-level confusion, but from unacknowledged epistemic fracture. It is precisely the kind of conflict that On the Modalities of Thought foresaw, where argument is attempted across structures that do not share ontological or interpretive rules, and where critique is issued without modal entry. This essay thus serves as the first applied demonstration of that foundational thesis. It reveals what happens when modal dissonance is left unnamed, where performance replaces engagement, and where misunderstanding hardens into certainty. And in naming that breakdown, it also models the alternative, a critique that begins with structure rather than opinion, and that confronts its subject not from above, but from within. If the prior essay made the case that critique without modal mapping is illegitimate, this essay shows what it looks like in practice. The theater of disagreement mistaken for thought. What follows in this series will continue this trajectory, not toward resolution, but toward a more precise vocabulary of encounter, where critique is no longer a reflex, but a responsibility. The appearance of argument, where there is none. There is a peculiar kind of disagreement that presents all the signs of high-level engagement: intellectual credentials, passionate debate, public interest, yet yields nothing but recursive friction. It is not marked by mere misunderstanding, nor by superficial opposition. Rather, it is a structural impasse disguised as argument. This is the condition that surrounds what might be called the Peterson phenomenon, the repeated spectacle of intelligent people talking past Jordan Peterson, and him talking past them, not out of willful avoidance, but because they are speaking in different cognitive architectures without naming that fact. It is tempting to explain this as miscommunication, but that term is insufficiently diagnostic. Miscommunication suggests that the message failed to reach its destination, or that a clearer signal might have sufficed. What is happening here is more foundational. It is not a failure of clarity. It is a failure of cognitive alignment at the modal level. That is, the very structure of thought each side uses to construct and validate meaning is not the same, and yet both sides behave as if it were. This is not a problem of poor reasoning. It is a problem of epistemic mapping that was never performed. Peterson, for all his inconsistencies and polarizing tendencies, operates within a symbolic hierarchical modality. His references are layered, drawn from myth, psychology, archetype, and metaphysical assumption. These are not rhetorical embellishments. They are the scaffolding of the claims themselves. To critique Peterson on the basis of empirical vagueness or definitional looseness is to speak a different language and blame him for not understanding it. His ideas function in a mode that privileges resonance, narrative recursion, and alignment with archetypal order, not analytic precision or falsifiability. One may reject that mode, but only after having entered and tested it from within. Anything less is performance. This is why the sharpest critiques of Peterson so often fail to land. They presume a shared modality of argumentation and operate accordingly. Isolate a claim, deconstruct its logic, expose contradiction, and declare incoherence. But these moves presume that the claims were designed to stand alone, that they operate propositionally rather than symbolically, and that coherence must manifest through immediate clarity. These assumptions, while common in academic and analytic modalities, do not apply to Peterson's architecture. As a result, the critic's attack often misses its mark, not because it is weak, but because it strikes a different structure altogether. The result is a stalemate with the illusion of dialogue. Both sides accumulate supporters who see their own modality reflected and assume victory. But no cross-modal translation has occurred. No structure has been entered, examined, or temporarily inhabited. Each side speaks to itself, imagines it is speaking across, and walks away affirmed, having misunderstood the nature of the disconnect entirely. This is not a minor misfire. It is the core dysfunction that defines our intellectual moment, and it reveals a deeper perpetualist claim that modal dissonance, unacknowledged, will always masquerade as disagreement, and in doing so will foreclose the possibility of true engagement before it even begins. Symbolic hierarchy and the recursive mind. To engage with Jordan Peterson's system of thought is not to read a line of reasoning, it is to enter a cosmology. His claims, often perceived as disjointed or evasive by critics, are not meant to be isolated and interrogated as discrete propositions. They are anchored in a recursive symbolic structure whose coherence is not linear but vertical, dependent not on stepwise clarity but on cumulative resonance across nested mythological, psychological, and moral strata. This modality of thought is not new. It draws its lineage from ancient metaphysical frameworks, where meaning is not constructed from premises but revealed through layered analogy, ritualized interpretation, and archetypal pattern recognition. Within such a structure, clarity is not the product of disambiguation. It is the emergent recognition of pattern symmetry across levels. To understand in this modality is not to reduce, but to reverberate, to hear in one register the echo of another, and to affirm that what is spoken here aligns with what has always been spoken elsewhere. In this sense, the coherence of a claim like clean your room is not moralistic minimalism, but a portal into a symbolic order, where chaos and order are not metaphors but ontological anchors that frame the entire architecture of being. The hierarchical quality of Peterson's mode stems not from authoritarianism, as his detractors sometimes imply, but from structural necessity. Symbols sit within symbols, meaning refracts downward through tradition, myth, and psyche, and the individual is always positioned within nested systems that exceed them. In this view, the world is not a neutral landscape to be mapped. It is a structured field of significance to be navigated, and navigation requires alignment, not with facts, but with patterns of meaning that have stood the test of human psycho-spiritual evolution. To argue against such a structure using the tools of analytic dissection is to enter a cathedral with a microscope, technically precise, but epistemically blind to the function of the space. A microscope may reveal the cracks in the stone, but it cannot tell you why the cathedral was built, nor what it does when inhabited. The analytic critic thus fails not in intellect, but in orientation. They do not recognize that the claims are held together not by argument, but by symbolic density, and that coherence is vertical, not lateral. This failure produces a paradox. The more rigorously a critic applies empirical or analytic pressure to a symbolic system, the more incoherent it will appear. This is not because the system is incoherent, but because its logic is not extractive. It is participatory. It cannot be paraphrased without being diminished, nor translated into clarity without losing what it was structured to preserve: depth, resonance, initiation into pattern. Perpetualism identifies this as a modal recursion loop. The critic, believing they are exposing vagueness, is in fact revealing their own dislocation. They cannot find clarity because they are demanding it on terms the system does not recognize as valid. And yet, Because they presume universality, they interpret the mismatch as failure rather than misalignment. The result is a recursive misfire, critique that deepens misunderstanding with each pass, feeding certainty in the absence of comprehension. This is not an argument for symbolic thought as superior. It is a demand that its internal grammar be recognized before critique can ethically proceed. Perpetualism does not ask the analytic critic to adopt the symbolic mode. It demands that they know what they are confronting, so that their disagreement reflects genuine engagement rather than epistemic projection. Until that structural recognition occurs, the phenomenon will persist. Intelligent people speaking past each other, each convinced the other is being evasive, irrational, or manipulative, when in fact, neither has yet learned to name the architecture of the other's mind. The analytic interrogative modality and the imperative of disassembly. The analytic interrogative modality, dominant in academic and technocratic cultures, is not just a style of thought, it is a structural ethic. It understands thinking as a process of exposure. A claim is valuable to the degree it can be broken down, tested, and reassembled under critical pressure. Its central impulse is disassembly. To understand something is to take it apart. To trust it is to know that once taken apart, it will still make sense. This modality has built the scaffolding of modern institutions. Law, science, policy. It has earned its authority. But its success also conceals a limitation. It treats resistance to disassembly as evidence of incoherence or deception. It assumes that a good idea should survive decontextualization. But not all thought operates that way. Some systems, like Peterson's, derive meaning not from reducibility, but from recursive coherence, where interrelation, not isolation, is the guarantor of sense. From within the analytic frame, this is difficult to see. The modality carries with it an implicit universality. That truth must be expressible in propositional clarity. That meaning should submit to interrogation, and that refusal to do so is a mark of intellectual bad faith. But when these assumptions are applied to symbolic systems, the effect is not illumination, it is erasure. The very structure that gives symbolic thought its coherence, its layered analogies, archetypal recursion, and internally nested logic, is precisely what makes it resistant to analytic parsing. And so the pattern repeats. The analytic critic encounters a symbolic statement, demands linear clarity, fails to extract it, and concludes dishonesty or incoherence. But this is not engagement. It is modal projection, the imposition of one modality's standards onto another structure, followed by critique when the expected yield does not appear. Perpetualism identifies this as a recurrent structural failure. To critique without first mapping modality is to critique a fiction of one's own making. The analytic modality, powerful as it is, cannot assume neutrality. It must recognize that not all thought reveals itself through the lens of disassembly. Some thought must be read as structure, not as data. And until that reading occurs, critique is indistinguishable from dismissal. The asymmetry of responsibility in modal engagement. To identify a modality is not yet to engage it, and to engage it ethically is not merely to recognize its structure, but to ask a deeper question. Who initiated the crossing? For perpetualism, the asymmetry of responsibility in discourse begins precisely here. It is not symmetrical because the weight of translation falls differently depending on who speaks first, who is on native ground, and who seeks to critique whom. When Peterson speaks publicly, he does so from within a symbolic hierarchical modality, but into a culture saturated with analytic interrogative expectations. His discourse enters a domain that prizes disassembly, clarity, and propositional rigor. From a perpetualist standpoint, this does not exempt him from the responsibility. To speak into a modal mismatch is to take on a burden, not to abandon one's mode, but to anticipate the dissonance and account for it. Peterson's tendency to oscillate between symbolic condensation and empirical language without delineating the shift invites modal confusion. It is not that he owes the analytic critic conformity, but he does, if he wishes to be understood, owe orientation. But the greater asymmetry lies with the critic. The moment one assumes the posture of critique, one assumes epistemic authority, the right to assess, judge, dismiss. This right is not granted by moral confidence or argumentative fluency. It is earned only through structural fluency, the demonstrated capacity to navigate the internal logic of the system one seeks to assess. In the absence of this fluency, critique becomes performance, the outward gesture of engagement without the inward labor of comprehension. This is the condition perpetualism renders explicit. Critique has preconditions, and those preconditions shift depending on directionality. When a thinker exports their modality into a domain not shaped by it, they must either make their structure intelligible or accept the interpretive distortions that follow. But when a critic approaches a thinker from outside their structure, the critic bears the ethical burden of not imposing their own modality as the metric of legitimacy. To do otherwise is not just bad critique, it is epistemic aggression disguised as intellectual rigor. This asymmetry also reveals why some thinkers appear evasive when they are, in fact, protecting structural integrity. Symbolic systems resist disassembly not because they are hiding something, but because their coherence degrades when forcibly translated. The act of translation is not neutral, it is invasive if done without care. And yet, translation is not avoidable. What perpetualism demands is not purity of modality, but consciousness of crossing, an awareness of what is lost, what is gained, and what is transformed when one thought architecture is rendered into the terms of another. This consciousness is rare. Most public discourse is built on the presumption of shared criteria, that logic is universal, that clarity is self-evident, that what is being said can be evaluated without first understanding how it is being said. This is not a failure of individual thinkers. It is a systemic refusal to confront the plural ontologies of thought, a refusal that hardens into institutional norm and eventually into the illusion of critique. And so the asymmetry remains. The speaker must bear the risk of being misunderstood, but the critic must bear the greater responsibility, not to understand everything, but to know when they do not. For in that moment, critique is suspended, not as surrender, but as integrity. The possibility of critique after misalignment is named. Once modal misalignment has been named, once the architecture of thought has been recognized, mapped, and temporarily inhabited, the nature of critique transforms. It no longer seeks to disprove, dismantle, or embarrass. It seeks to expose tension from within, to engage a system not at its edges, but at its seams. This form of critique cannot be performed from above. It must be issued from inside with fluency, precision, and the willingness to let the system's own logic reveal its limits. This is the terrain where perpetualist critique begins, not in opposition, but in entry, not in summary judgment, but in architectural tension. The critic becomes not a sniper, but a structural analyst. Their task is no longer to win the argument, but to reveal where the system bends under its own weight, where its internal commitments collide, and where its mode, while coherent on its own terms, becomes incommensurate with the demands it places on others. In the case of Peterson, such critique would not ask, is conscience empirically testable? A question which only reveals the critic's modality. It would ask, within the symbolic hierarchical frame, what does God is conscience do? What patterns does it anchor? What existential burdens does it attempt to resolve? And where, within that structure, does it overextend or mask its own commitments? The critique would emerge not from the failure to meet external standards, but from internal inconsistencies that arise once the modality has stabilized into structure. This is not a soft critique. It is more difficult. It requires more time, more humility, and a willingness to inhabit frameworks one does not share. It also requires a radical redefinition of what it means to understand. Understanding, in perpetualist terms, is not the ability to paraphrase. It is the ability to trace a structure's internal tension without distorting its form. This is the highest form of disagreement, not because it avoids conflict, but because it commits to fidelity before opposition. The horizon this opens is not consensus, but legitimacy. Dialogue may not resolve differences, but it becomes credible. It ceases to be theater. Critique no longer reads as a power move, but as a deliberate act of epistemic responsibility, undertaken not for rhetorical advantage, but to test the integrity of a structure on its own terms. This, too, is what makes perpetualism vulnerable. It cannot dismiss critiques from those outside its frame, but it also cannot recognize those critiques as valid until their modal fluency is demonstrated. This is not defensiveness, it is structural protectionism in the service of philosophical clarity. If a system is to be taken down, let it be done by one who has climbed through its interior, not by one who stands at a distance and declares it incomprehensible. When critique emerges from this position, after misalignment has been named and navigated, it has a different force. It does not merely say, I disagree. It says, I have walked your path, and I see where it falters. This is the critique that cannot be dismissed as ignorance, because it arises from knowledge. It cannot be deflected as projection, because it names the architecture before it questions it. It is not critique that closes, but critique that opens. This is what perpetualism asks of thought in the public sphere. Not agreement, not accommodation, but the integrity of engagement earned through structural entry. For only then does critique transcend its performance and become what it was meant to be, not judgment from without, but pressure from within. With that, I hope you enjoyed this exploration. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing.